Program panel. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for wandering your way down here to the bowels of the Crown Plaza. I'm Jim Lowder. Matt Forbeck will eventually be joining us from the costume contest to moderate. I'll fill in for Matt until he shows up, which is actually an excellent summary of how fiction worked at TSR. No one really ever expected to be dropped into the roles they were taking, either as a writer or an editor. I worked in the fiction department at TSR from '88 until '94. I was an editor and a series editor for the Forgotten Realms and Ravenloft and Dark Sun, and also wrote several novels for the company, and edited the first two Forgotten Realms anthologies, Realms of Valor and Realms of Infamy. Since then, I've been involved in publishing as a full-time freelancer, but we'll get started by having everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll talk about the progression of the fiction program at the company, starting with Rose's era, and we'll go up from there. Rose, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Rose Estes, and I created the Endless Quest series of books.
And in doing so, created what would become the fiction program for the company.
I'm Matt Greenwood. I created the Forgotten Realms and was then asked by the company to, write a Forgotten Realms novel.
I'm Jeff Grubb, and I helped with Ed in creating the campaign setting that you basically see in the rule sets. And as a result, started writing novels with my wife, Kate Novak. We did Azure Bonds, which turned into a computer game, and a whole series of novels about...
And game products.
6 novels afterwards. They're set in the realms with the two of us teamed up, which has been great.
So with Dungeons & Dragons, fiction has always been part of the game's orbit. From Appendix N in the original DMG, with listing the literary influences for Gary and Dave and the other people involved in creating the game, to fiction regularly appearing in Dragon Magazine. From the earliest issues, it was part of what the community of players and designers included in their influences. But it wasn't something the company regularly published until Rose brought in the idea for the Endless Quest books, which, and here they come.
Speaking of
yes. So, how did that come about?
Well, the company and I had sort of an off and on relationship. Sometimes we liked each other, and most of the time we didn't. Things were slow one summer, and I had taken my kids gone to a tent circus that had come to Lake Geneva, and much to my surprise, met somebody that I knew. And they said, why don't you come along? It'll give you some great articles for newspapers. So I said, sounds good. Talked to my boss. They had no problem with me leaving at all. So I took a leave of absence and traveled with this circus for about 3 weeks. And we stopped in Decorah, Iowa, and I went in to do my laundry in town and found a shelf with books that you could read while your laundry was being done. And I picked up Montgomery's Cave of Time, Choose Your Own Adventure. And my job had been trying to explain the game, which was an uphill battle. I was talking to parents, clergy, teachers, all of whom were convinced that we were leading their children into demonology. And it was just a really hard sell trying to talk to people who didn't want to hear anything you had to say and convince them that we were good guys. So when I saw this Choose Your Own Adventure, I realized instantly that it was the way to explain the game, and called the trip done that day and went back home and walked into my boss's office and put the book on the corner of his table and said, we should do this. And he said no. And I continued bugging them until they finally said, if you think this is such a hot idea, you go home and do it yourself. And it made me so angry, I did. And I brought it in and said, here it is. Will you look at it now? And he said no. And it sat on the corner of his desk for 3 months.
Wow.
And never touched it. And they went to a sales conference with Random House. It was their first. And it was in Puerto Rico. And they came back on January 2nd and dropped the manuscript on my desk and said, write 3 more. We need them by April 1st. I did. I wrote them all longhand on legal pads, and my hand has never been the same since. Seriously. And, you know, the last numbers I heard were 21 million copies.
Wow.
So TSR, when they did the distribution deal with Random House, that was to get the game out into the wider market, and Random House is primarily a fiction publisher. So when they came back, okay, yes, we can do this distribution for the game, but what else do you have that's more like what we already do? And fortunately, at that time, they had Rose's EQ.
But they didn't know what it was because none of them had read it.
Right.
They just said, do you have anything different besides game modules?
Right.
Like, do you have books? Because that's what we do.
Right.
And so he remembered that manuscript and said, well, yes, we have 1. And they said, we need 4.
And part of that is the way the book trade works. They're looking at that for, if we're going to convince bookstores to carry this, we need to tell them 4 quarters in advance that we have releases coming out each quarter.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, that's the company having to scramble and react. You thought I was kidding about getting dropped into those roles. That's the history of D&D's fiction in the first really 2 decades of the program.
And also, it's not just one book.
Right.
Here we have a book, we're publishing it, that's nice. It's basic. We have a line.
Right.
So we can continue to feed the beast
Right.
all the way through.
Yeah.
And our early deals with Random House, and Rose can correct me on it, was from a merchandising standpoint as opposed to a book standpoint.
Right.
And so therefore, while they were looking for books, they were feeling that, you know, like our relationship with Random House was with the same wing of Random House that did puzzles and, you know, scented candles
Right.
and other tchotchkes that you basically find in a bookstore.
And to get Random House to buy in, offering them the book.
What? We could have had a Driz scented candle?
Yeah. they're working on that now.
Yes.
That's part of the monetization
Brow sweat.
model. Get brow sweat. Very nice.
Also, if a book is good, they don't know what they're buying. And so if a book is good and it's going to take off, they don't want to pay a minimum amount for the first book
Right.
and then have to cough up much bigger dollars.
This was a
for
bestseller,
the-
so the second contract has to be that much bigger. Yeah, that's a
Right.
great point. That's a great point. And at the time, TSR, you know, didn't have anybody in-house who were book editors or fiction editors or fiction department. This was being done out of effectively what had been planned as an educational department in the
Right.
company, where they were going to create Jim Ward and Gene Black were going to create these modules that would then be sold into schools and teach kids math tying into Dungeons and Dragons. But they didn't think through, you actually need to get those approved through curriculum processes, which are very rigid at schools and at the state level, and so they couldn't ever get anybody to take those seriously. And they had created, they brought in educational psychologists and content experts and created, I think, was it something like that.
I think something like that, because again, 4 is a magic number.
Right.
So.
Right, and two language and 2 math, something like that, and tried to sell those, and that didn't take off. And so Jim and Gene then became the underpinning for the department that had to put the EQ books together.
They never knew what to do with me.
So who edited those initial books?
I don't want to say. It was, nobody was an editor.
Right.
I had been a journalist. I was more of an editor than they were.
Right, with your journalism experience, you had
Right.
expectations for how the editing should go.
Yeah, it got passed around from one person to
Yep.
the next, and usually I wound up correcting their grammar and punctuation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a mess in the beginning, and a lot of egos don't like to be told that they can't edit. You know, writers tend to think that what they write is what's right, and it should be left alone. Gary was a prime example of that. He did not want anybody to touch his work. So you prayed you didn't get tapped.
I got him to change something once. For the essay he did for me for Hobby Games 100 Best, I got him to take out like 2 whole paragraphs in the middle. That was, for a short work, that was huge.
Yes.
So Matt Forbeck, our actual moderator.
Sorry.
So we've got the program up to the Endless Quest books come in. They do spectacularly well, and actually the timing for all of this is perfect because Dungeons and Dragons as a game is facing the Satanic Panic blowback, and sales of the game have started to decline, and they needed another revenue stream. And the Endless Quest books, as Rose has already said, with millions of copies being sold, suddenly proliferate in the company, and they're doing Heart Quest books and all sorts of various versions of the EQ formula to capitalize on the massive success of those initial books. And that's where we are. So.
You seem like you're doing a hell of a job, don't you?
You see, if it stayed away for 5 more minutes, he would have got us to tomorrow.
Yeah, there we go. Well, so the next part in the history is, all right, so we're doing Endless Quest books.
Right.
We should be doing fiction.
Right.
And they try a couple of things. They have, and this was Gene Black, who was at this point the editor for the line, and this is early to mid 80s. And they have they buy Amazing Stories. TSR buys Amazing Stories, and they publish some anthologies of reprint Amazing Stories fiction. They do some reprints of Fantastic Magazine as well, and these are famous science fiction fantasy story reprints, and those are being packaged and sold, and those are being edited because there really is no editing being done in the book department by people connected to the magazine.
Yeah,
Right.
Kim.
Kim Mohan was
Yeah.
very much involved in that, and Pat Price,
Right.
and
Yeah.
the other people from magazines, and somehow Gene comes up with the idea, and Jeff will be able to talk about this,
Okay.
of we should be doing something like Dragonlance.
Okay, the whole Dragonlance story comes out of the games area. We just had a panel discussion of that earlier today, in which it has several origins. One of them is a story that basically Tracy and Laura were telling to each other as they came across the country to come to work for TSR. One origin is they did a marketing survey, and the marketing people came back and said, it's called Dungeons and Dragons, but you don't have a lot of products with dragons in it. That would be good.
Right.
And one origin was they asked us all to come up with 3 module sets. And modules were, done in trilogies because they had been done for the G series and the D series, etc. And so everybody came up with 3 low-level adventures, 3 mid-level adventures, 3 high-level adventures, 3 Boot Hill modules, and 3 mini games.
Gangbusters.
3 gangbusters. I felt the gangbusters one somewhere, And Tracy's pitch involved 3 levels of dragons, which quickly expanded out to 10 and then 12. And with that original team put together, and the team was, Tracy was the first one, and Harold Johnson was the second. I was the third guy, and Carl Smith was our editor, because we had editors by then.
In games.
In games. And put together a pitch to the management, and Tracy tells that, he basically met with all the managers privately before we made the pitch. So he sold it in before we had the presentation. And the great vision of Dragonlance was what they would call now the IP. It was going to be modules, but it was also going to be fiction.
Right.
And it was also going to be bath towels. And it was going to be action figures.
Underoos.
Play sets.
Think of the marketing.
Yeah. Dessert toppings.
Dessert toppings.
All sorts of, stuff. And that became the foundation for Dragonlance.
Right.
As far as that.
Underoos.
And
Right.
at that time, Tracy had, I mentioned this earlier, at that time we had a period where we were not supposed to work on new projects until management approved the stuff that we were doing.
Right.
So we had a period where we were effectively blue sky. And Tracy did all the maps, he did the timelines, he did the background, he sketched out the story, and I was over here doing superhero stuff. And that's where the original plot for Dragonlance came from.
Right.
And they said,
And they weren't originally supposed to, Margaret and Tracy
Right.
were not the original authors
the original choice for
for the novel.
They said
Gene
thank-
Black in the book department had hired a different writer.
2 different writers.
Two different writers.
They went to a professional, well-known writer, and the money was, I got this from Harold Johnson.
Right.
The money was a challenge, to be polite. They went to another author, who wanted to take it in their own direction. So the way Harold tells it, he was going to tell the guy, okay, don't quit the day job, and then discovered the guy did quit his day job, so he could work on this. So, and then only then they came back to Tracy, and they said, okay, you can write it for
a
miserable
amount of money.
because we had spent it on other writers.
And Tracy was staff at the time.
Right.
And the thinking inside the company is, well, we're paying, you've got insurance through us and you have a salary, so
Right.
you actually don't need this as your day job.
I always got that there was a legal obligation. Why are we paying you twice to do the same thing?
Right.
You're doing it over here. So.
Yeah, I'm doing it at home and not as part of my job.
Yeah.
And so Margaret had
Anyway.
been working in the book department at the time.
Margaret had joined up.
Yeah, you were. I was going to say you had left. Gene was turning the book department into an actual department at that point. Hired Margaret as an editor. Hired
Right.
Bill Larson as an editor. Bill had been working at Western Publishing on Trixie Belden.
He was Trixie Belden.
He was
Yeah.
Trixie Belden, and Bill was used to working on those YA series books, things like that. And
I'm picturing Bill as Trixie Bell.
right, yeah, exactly, yes. And then they had Pat McGilligan and Mary
Right.
Kirchhoff would come in later as editors, and Mary had started in the magazine department under Kim
Right.
for Aries, and they will become more important later.
But the idea was that basically, we'll let you write it straight, but you have to have a published author as your co-writer.
Right.
Margaret had written a YA history young adult history of Jesse James. So she qualified. So Tracy and Margaret and Tracy started talking about the plot they had come up with, that Laura and Tracy had come up, and things changed and things evolved, and characters came in and characters grew, and that's the point for me when the two of them combined.
Right.
The Dragonlance really ignited as far as a product. That we would joke that they were going out for Dragon Lunch. Because they'd go off somewhere, and they basically with Mike Williams, and they would do it would do a lunch, and they would argue about various points. And we threw a lot of game stuff in. We basically added stuff, but literally that first series came out of the path that Tracy built, and Margaret's favorite characters. Because when we started, okay, we have a bunch of adventurers. We should have a fighter and a wizard, and they're brothers. Okay, fine, they're brothers. And one of them should be big and strong, the other should be sweet. Tracy named them the Caring Man and the Wasting Man. Became Caramin and Raceland. And I gave Caramin, Raceland his gold skin and hourglass eyes. And and Terry Phillips, before they did the first plays, gave him that whispering voice.
Right.
They had play tests. We were play testing the early modules. My wife was the first Caravan. Mike Williams came along and he filled in the role and brought it to life. So
Right.
they were building the characters out of their game sessions.
So those books go crazy. They shoot to the top of the bestseller, but they shoot to the top of what would have been the bestseller list if the stores that reported to the New York Times and the other places at that point were ordering them. But they also get international sales.
Right.
They get translated very quickly from the success of those first 6. And at the same time, TSR does the Windwalker line, because now they're thinking we're going to be a real fiction publisher, so we'll do these creator-owned Windwalker books, but they were very YA leaning, very young adult leaning, because that was Gene's interest.
And this is all through the fiction history. We've had attempts of we're going to go do something different. We're going to break
Right.
into the mass market. This was the Grail.
And that's the transition.
And they would hit. Sometimes they would hit. Bimbos of the Death Sun.
Oh yeah, you're right. Bimbos
Yes.
of the Death Sun was one of the books in the Windwalker line, not YA. It's a murder mystery set in a science fiction convention. And it won an Edgar Award,
Yeah.
which from a small publisher out in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin was huge.
And this is something to keep in mind here. We weren't New York publishing.
Right.
We didn't know what we were doing.
Right. So
making it up as we went along.
So the Dragonlance books take off. They try the Windwalker line. It's sort of a success. The books are good, but they're having trouble getting them into bookstores. But Dragonlance is opening all of these doors. So they start doing other series.
Now,
Gary,
I'm
just
going to hit something
Yeah.
because I think something that really affected our reach and reaching out was the rise of the mall bookstore and the
Absolutely.
big box bookstore.
Absolutely.
Suddenly, bookstores were more than just some independent that was operating. There was a chain of them, and they demanded content. They were put stuff on the shelves. So suddenly, we're seeing the Endless Quest books come in and going to this mall bookstore.
Yes.
We're seeing the Dragonlance really took off about the same time the
Yep.
big boxes showed up.
B. Daltons and Waldens loved TSR, in part because the books weren't taken seriously initially, so the genre bookstores and the main bookstores weren't carrying them, but the kids who read these books were in the malls.
Yeah.
And so the books,
A&B hobbies.
right, yeah, exactly, yes, the hobby stores as well that the EQ books got into.
Right.
And so there was a point, and I mentioned this I think it was in the Ravenloft panel, that in 1991, Locus Magazine, which is the industry insider magazine of science fiction and fantasy, reported that TSR was the #1 best-selling publisher for science fiction and fantasy in the United States. We had the largest percentage of bestsellers at B. Daltons and Walden Books, and they handled more than 50% of the sales in the country. And TSR had 17% of the bestsellers at those chains with 23 books.
Wow.
And we beat Random House and Del Rey and Doubleday, who were publishing 200 books each.
Yeah.
And TSR, with our little 3-person department and a managing editor, was beating them with the 23 books that we published
And
in
we were-
1990.
And we were also, because I mentioned that we were working with the merchandising
Yep.
department, we were not mass market paperbacks, though we looked like them.
Right.
We were considered trade paperbacks,
Right.
which were, in the parlance of the time, were not officially returnable.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, stuff goes out from the warehouse, it's considered sold.
And the stores were enthusiastic about selling them, so they would advertise them very heavily.
Right, we did a
And
lot of
because they
signings.
were, when we did tons of signings, and they were a chain, so they were advertising across the country.
Right.
With this. So the other thing that comes up then, Dragonlance has done really well. Windwalker is kind of going in. So they do. Gary, who was against fiction being connected to the games, decides, well, I think I should do a couple of Greyhawk novels.
Well, yes.
And
we should note, too, Gary wrote the first fiction in Dragon Magazine.
right, yes,
A serial short story by Gary Ernst.
right,
So,
right.
yeah.
But at the same time, he was saying in Dragon Magazine that this wasn't narrative and it wasn't connected to fiction. So that's where Rose comes back, in for the Greyhawk series that they get you to do. And that's where the Forgotten Realms come in, because we're looking for what else can we do in 1987.
Dragonlance did very, very well. Okay, what are we doing next?
Right.
You know, are we going to, what happens when that starts declining over time? Because books do that over time.
So how does the Realms come into that picture?
Can we go for
with
the
the
story?
fiction?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Well, as I recall, things got rather confused.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeff
shocker.
said, do you have time to write fiction? I said, sure. And he said, okay, we need you to introduce the realms to us. We need a sort of travelogue thing that shows us the realms. Show us the realms. I said, okay. And then Gene
Gene
said-
Black.
Gene Blashfield Black,
Yep.
who wasn't head of the book department for too much longer after
Right.
that.
So yes, this is around 1987
Yeah.
that this is happening.
Says, I'm thinking a traditional fantasy trilogy. So you've got about this much word count and some sort of quest, but not like Dragonlance. Don't do the same thing again. So I start merrily running Spellfire.
Right.
And everything changes.
Right. And before that, Darkwalker on Moonshade gets attached to.
Yeah.
Allow
Yeah,
me
please
to
do.
fill
Yeah.
in the bits of the early stuff. Initially contacted Ed and asked him, you've been writing articles for Dragon Magazine. Is there a world under here? Can we build a campaign setting? Can we tell more stories? Ed was very receptive. We paid him a horribly small amount of money and a Macintosh without a hard drive.
Yep.
He promised to publish books.
And they even tried to write broken.
Yeah, we gave you a hard drive next year because we really loved you.
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Yes,
and
you
that
did.
that was a good thing because I could imagine you swapping discs out of a Mac
Oh.
SE.
Well, they don't, yeah, and I myself bought the second external floppy drive,
Yeah.
so I could do this.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it takes you 18 minutes to get to a blank screen in Microsoft Word where
Right.
you start working. And if you had an idea,
This is
you better
primitive
have
stuff.
this.
So, at the same time, again, we're talking about Windwalker, we're talking about different opportunities. TSR UK wanted to do their own Dragonlance, and with a Celtic flair. And they basically, Doug Niles picked up the book task, and he's working on the book, and then we closed down the TSR UK office. And so he has a half-written book. Ed and I are working on the gray box set. So we adopt his Moonshade novel, redraw the Moonshades, which were an archipelago like Earthsea as opposed to this big UK thing. And the Dark Walker on Moonshade became our first novel.
And except for the freebie map,
Yeah.
our first Forgotten Realms release.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And at the same time, Bob Salvador, who had previously written a novel
That was-
about Marines on a dinosaur island.
That is correct. And actually, the first book Bob pitched was a sequel to Darkwalker on
Yes,
Moonshade.
it was. Oh God. They gave it to me, and Bob's got a very different voice than Doug, and I'm reading it.
A bit.
It's a little more visceral. It's a little more action oriented. And I run into Doug, and I say, Doug, I've read the first chapter of your new novel, and I have to say it's a very different in style for that. And he looks at me and says, I didn't turn in a new novel. Yes.
So
But Bob
Mary,
got the second
Mary Kirchhoff, who had moved over into books from Aries Magazine and some other things in the company, had spotted Bob's work
Yes.
and recognized the talent, and then said, "Okay, what else do you got?" And so he came back with Crystal Shard, and part of that was creating Drist on the fly on the
Right.
phone as another character to be added to the story.
And it was very much a case, you can create your own characters for this. I can do that?
I could
yeah,
do that?
Yeah, okay, fine.
So
But,
you're
yeah,
seeing the pattern of all of this being carefully planned at every stage.
Exactly. A lot of it it's falling into place. People are showing up
Oh.
at the scenes at the right moment. So
I got to tell you one quickie theory.
Right, sure.
So at that point, Mary sends me the Crystal Shard manuscript and says, is there anything in here that doesn't fit? And I said, oh, please don't use Grimwald, which was one of the wizards, because Grimwald was the running joke in my home campaign. And I didn't want Bob to
Right.
build up Grimwald into something that
He
my
wasn't.
home players would go, what?
Yeah.
It's Grimwald! But I I was commuting 120 miles a day to work and home again at that point, and I'd be dog tired when I got home, and I would have to play with a cat, so I would lie on the floor of the living room floor, which had a nice carpet, and read the manuscript, page by loose page, as it was mailed to me, and the cat's walking all over it saying, "Feed me," you know. So and generally damaging the manuscript, and then I get this call from Mary. It says, "Oh, have you finished? We need the manuscript back." And I said, "The manuscript?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Yeah, we sent you the only one."
Oh, God.
So, apropos of what Jim just said about
Yeah, and so,
Planning, professionalism.
yeah, right. And so Rose gets brought back in to write Greyhawk novels at that point,
Yeah.
even though you are not familiar with Greyhawk.
Not a bit. And I so apologize. I even apologized to Gary, because I'm sure he was rolling in his grave.
This is the point. I came into the company in '88, went right after Mary Kirchhoff had taken over the department. And I was hired because Bill Larson and Eric Severson, who were the other two full-time editors, Bill wasn't a gamer, and he wasn't much of a fantasy fan. He liked mystery and historical stuff. And if you look at the direction Doug Niles' books go in, this is why they were such a great match. Bill was a perfect editor for Doug. Eric Severson had an agricultural journalism major. He became Bob's editor and was the perfect editor for Bob because he was not a gamer in any way, and Bob knew the game perfectly. So what Eric did was push Bob away from doing stuff that was all gamer fantasy tropes, and that made those Drizzt books much more generally accessible than Bob would have done.
Character-driven, right?
Yeah, character-driven, if Bob hadn't had Eric as an editor. Again, this sheer luck of all of this going on.
You look at the first 4 novels for that year, it would be very difficult to point at Drizzt and say, "Yeah, there's our breakout character.
Right.
There's our Fonzie
Right.
Fonzarelli."
Right. So, I started in the department because I was a gamer, but also had literary background and an English major and had worked on my college literary magazine and had really clear ideas about how the editing should work and how things should be set up in a book department to foreground authorial voice. So what wouldn't happen is what happened with Ed and Spellfire.
Yes.
And
let me give you the quick sanitized version here. I've been told a trilogy,
yes.
and Mary has a baby at this point.
Right.
So she's breastfeeding. So she's at home. And everybody who worked at TSR had a sort of pass key, like a little credit card that you could slap on a magnetic thing and get into the building.
Right.
So people who needed to work odd hours for whatever creative reason, and this is actually really good for creatives, you can come in on your own time. So I would get phone calls from Mary in which the middle of the phone call would be, "Wait a minute, oops, sorry, thump, 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 thump. I'm changing boobs." She dropped the telephone receiver as she was breastfeeding and she was coming in late. And she would
This
say,
is the sanitized version.
"This is the sanitizer."
Yes, it is.
Because she's editing Spellfire, and what she doesn't dare tell me until it's done, because she expects me to hit the roof, is they're taking it from a trilogy to a single book.
Right.
Yeah.
And not
Right,
before,
this sounds familiar.
not before I write it, but after I've delivered the manuscript.
Oh, my.
Right.
And this is where things like, if you've ever noticed in the Monsters Compendium, there's a Darken Beast monster. Well, that was originally, I called it a dark horror, and which is too close to some people's Cthulhu stuff, okay? So they changed the name. But I got this confused phone call from an artist from TSR. He said, "I've read through the entire manuscript, and where do these appear? I'm looking for a description. I can't find it."
Right.
Well, what I didn't, and I'm saying, "Oh, it's on page 326 of my original paper manuscript," but I have no idea what you're looking at, because presumably the secretarial pool has inputted all by now. Because we had all these nice ladies who were inputting everything into the mainframe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and the artist says, "I can't find them anywhere." So I pull out my copy. He goes, by then I'd learned from the horror story with Bob's manuscript, everything I mailed off, I photocopied in case the Postal Service lost it. So I'm reading my photocopies. This, by the way, saved my ass. Because when I found out it was down to a single book and I was asked to revise, I literally took my photocopies and magic mending tape and I cut out paragraphs I was saving and taped them to an 8.5 by 11 page, typed what needed to go in,
Right.
taped it again, taped headers on, because
Wait, you did that with your notes to me.
Yeah.
And he would put things along the side, and this is before he had his computer.
this is how great literature is.
Yeah.
But literally,
before he had the computer, he was using a typewriter
Yeah.
that had a bad T key.
Yes.
God.
So he would basically type a single space, page, and then he would draw all the little T's. It was like working in a little graveyard,
So it was my father's Underwood 8, and by the way, if you ever get one of those and you need to stop your car sliding down a steep slope, just attach it to the Underwood 8. It's heavier than the car. Anyway, so Mary was telescoping the book down and losing big chunks of it, and was trying to finesse the facts so I wouldn't fly off the handle. And I was just sad that we were losing chunks of it when I found out. But the contracts came later because professionalism.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
And the other thing, the first three, so editing goes through 3 stages. It's proofreading, copy editing, and story editing, doing the story acquisition. The 3 people sitting here, the first book that I proofread was Demon Hand, and I changed a Mike the Wolf Nomad back to Micah the Wolf Nomad that had gotten through with a typist. It wasn't your fault. It was Mike the Wolf Nomad, which was just great, which is why I remembered it all the time. First book I copy edited was doing a line edit on Spellfire. Everybody used to say ye and thee in that book, and I got to go line by line and change them all out to you and your, until Ed and Mary had another conversation where, no, Elminster can speak with ye and thee. And I got to go through the whole book again, line by line, list with this primitive line editor, and put all of stupid Elminster.
Give me a cod loose
weaker. And Jeff's and Kate's book, As Your Bonds, was actually the first book I did story editing on as an assistant to Mary. It was the book that Mary trained me on how to work with authors. And the thing was, is what we were trying to do is change the department so that didn't happen.
Right.
And that was where so when you look at where the TSR book department and the fiction program connected to D&D took off, it was 88, 89, 90. So by the time we're doing the Ravenloft series and the Dark Sun books that Troy wrote, those are books that the authors had way more control over,
Right.
and they were done in collaboration with the game department, so there wasn't all of this conflict going on all the time.
Right. Troy was involved in the design of Dark Sun, so therefore that
Right.
had that.
And Brom was involved, and
In the
he was
art.
coming down and doing the art and the covers, and all of this is completely different from
Yeah.
when you started.
And just to briefly jump ahead chronologically, just to illustrate that, by the time I'm doing my most recent 6 or 8 Realms books, games department is saying, okay, you need to mention this somewhere in the story because it supports this product. They won't tell me about the product because I'm
Right.
not in-house,
Right.
but we need a Cloud Giant's castle.
Right.
We need this to show up.
Right.
Okay, so what's the dating? What's the Realms date? Okay, and these things in, but we don't want them to be foreground in your story because your story isn't supposed to be about that because we don't want you to write details that's going to screw up.
That's
the
going to
game
mess
thing.
up the
that
novel,
that you
the
don't
game stuff.
officially know about, but we need them in there so it supports it, so they all dovetail, so it feels like a unified world. So they mastered the process by later on.
Yeah, and so and this was all being done in real time with stuff like Avatar, which was my first editing assignment as an editor. Was just do the transition from first to second edition D&D. This super important books that, oh my God, and Ed was working on the modules, and Jeff was doing connected comics,
Right.
and all of this is being done in real time, with no real understanding of what we were doing. But by the time we got to Empires, we had fixed all of these processes, and it ran much more smoothly. So the TSR fiction stuff, and we'll get it up to the present, and then we'll take some questions, the process works really well. Wizards of the Coast buys TSR. They, for a little while, think they're going to they're going to revitalize the fiction program. They bring Mary Kirchhoff back out in Renton. They start to relaunch. They sell to Hasbro, and two things happen at once that lead to where we are right now with fiction. The first is the OGL, where Wizards of the Coast internally decided that the game rules were more important than world building and the subsidiary things like fiction. Those were things that the company was less interested in, so they started canceling lines like Ravenloft. The other thing that happened was Hasbro doesn't publish their own stuff. When they do novels and comics and things like that, they license it. They're not book publishers. So for a brief time, it looked like Hasbro was going to make Wizards of the Coast and the fiction department the licensing fiction arm for all of Hasbro. That almost happened.
Yes.
So for like 6 to 9 months, that was in the works. Then they decided, no,
Yeah.
we're not going to do that.
Thomas Reed wrote a Centipede
Yes.
novel. He was my cube mate at the time.
Right. And so
they just killed it.
they just killed
were
it. They
done.
decided, you know what, we're not going to do this. When those two things happened, the fiction program connected to Dungeons and Dragons being published by Wizards was doomed. It took years for it to wither,
Yeah.
but they started losing key staff, and so all of the editorial knowledge that the company didn't have at the start with the EQ books, that had accumulated in the 90s and in the initial hires at Wizards of the Coast left. All of the fiction specialists for distribution and sales left. And so the books, they did fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer, and now what they're doing is mostly licensing to other publishers.
And we also, at that point, switched away from Random House.
Right.
Went to St. Martin's.
Right.
For
So the
a brief period. We're back at
distribution
Random House.
changed
So
as well.
our distribution changed and their needs changed
Right.
as well.
So that's why we are where we are now for all of this, for the art.
Which means, though, we do have Tracy and Margaret writing new books, we have Bob writing new books,
Yep.
but they're deals that they have put together coordinating between
Another publisher.
and Wizards of the Coast.
Right, and that
So-
seemed to be led by them as their agents
Exactly.
as opposed to
Absolutely.
the company, right?
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. We have time for a few questions, so, yeah. Do you want to do?
Sure.
Even in the
Thanks.
90s, at the low point of TSR, the novel line was what, the second largest fantasy publisher in the U.S.
Right.
And even when Hasbro decided to wind it down, part of what spun off from it became Paizo.
Yes.
Right,
Which had its own fiction line.
right.
Do you guys ever wonder if Hasbro had given it the support it needed, if you guys could have continued on and
The book trade has changed really radically, in part because what, Rose mentioned and other people mentioned about, bookstores are not as much of a big thing now. It's all sales through Amazon.
Right.
The mall stores and the KB and
all
the
those
other
things.
stores that loved that fiction, they don't exist.
Right.
So it's hard to think about what
But
would be captured.
it's still a possibility.
Right.
Because one of the things that TSR and Wizards and Hasbro, whatever you call it, has been good at is trying everything as games and entertainment change.
Yeah.
They don't always follow through. The computer game division getting canceled because computers will
Repeatedly.
never amount to anything.
Oh my God.
Okay, there is a swing back and forth. We're gonna license everything out. Okay, we're not happy with what we're getting. We're gonna bring it all in. Okay, that really is kind of expensive.
Yes.
Let's send it out again.
And it
Yeah.
takes, and that's
Swing back and
that's
forth.
yeah, that's a
Like a
great point
5-year
because
cycle.
it's specialists, right?
Yeah.
To do fiction right, and it's what Rose was saying initially, right? I mean, how many of the people that you worked with at TSR had ever edited a book before, a fiction book?
Nobody.
Bingo.
Yeah. And you lose those people over time if you don't keep the department
And
going.
there's another thing I've noticed recently. I've been in Barnes and Nobles and the like. Is a demise of the mass market book.
Right.
Mhm.
The little mass market
Little
paperback
on the
is,
spinner rack. You know, I can see them in grocery stores, but a lot of them have turned all into trade paperbacks.
right,
To that
because they can
oversized
charge,
a little more.
$15 for them rather than $6.
Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing that change happening, you know, at this level.
Right.
Over here.
Something that I appreciate Rose and you read on the Illness Quest book at TSR, because I remember you from when I was like 13 years old, my dad, and I had those books, you know, I was reading, and he read them cover to cover. You only just get the whole idea of going through the quest, he just read it one page after the other. And he came to me afterward and said, I read this book, I understood it, I understood everything that happened, but I don't want to ever see one again. And it was like the mental taxi of trying to keep track of it as you read it through, you know, cover to cover instead of each individual.
Wow.
That's a huge
Yeah, but-
misunderstanding.
But right, but when you were writing those,
Yeah.
right? I mean, now,
You did
when
the
you
new-
do an
you
Endless
did-
Quest book, you do a Pick-a-Path book, you use Twine and other computer programs to keep track of all of these
Right,
plots
you
and
do?
everything else.
Yes. when Kate did the Hard Quest books, which did Marvel Superheroes
Right.
Endless Quest, we basically had that twine and that sketch, and I basically pulled out old sheets of engineering
Yep.
drawings, and I'm
Yeah.
drawing on
Yep.
the back, basically with my engineering templates,
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
okay, here's a choice.
So
this is a
when
square.
you wrote the initial ones, what were you using for your process? I mean, how did you keep track of the paths?
I drew things on a whiteboard, you know, and just tracked them that way. But the biggest problem was how to decide what page everything went to.
Yeah.
That was the hardest
Because of the
part.
length of, differing lengths of text.
Right. Right.
Pardon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a challenge. I write a bunch of that stuff too. I wrote the last 6 Endless Quest books, and usually you just flow chart it out ahead of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Figure out how
And-
many
and-
endings
But there
are.
are publishers doing similar, what you might call knockoff books, who do it the old way. They pin stuff up or they put it on the
Yeah,
floor.
they look like
and-
murder
Yeah,
investigations.
yes.
And let me hit you with Welcome to the Future. Within computer games, basically conversations and trees are all done on widgets, which occupy a little box. And basically, if there's a choice involved, you're building 2 more boxes.
Yep.
And so you're trying to avoid overloading the system with too much choice.
Right.
But literally, that's where we see as a descendant of our Endless Quest book.
Absolutely. And when somebody's writing those or publishing them and they get them wrong, and you're editing, it's hell. And I say that because I just ran into that 6 months ago, where a book was translated from Spanish, an Endless Quest type book, and I was asked to edit it, and I'm going through and I realized they messed up the paths.
Oh.
They didn't keep track of the seasons. This character died 40 pages ago, and you run into him again here. And I had to, Bill
It's
Larson.
magic.
It's magic. Bill Larson had taught me the process for marking up manuscript pages, because I edited parts of the last EQ book that TSR did when he went on vacation. Here's the process. See you later, kid. Off he goes. I'm on vacation now. And I had to dig those things out and actually use them again about like 6 months ago
Wow.
in fixing the paths for this. And it actually worked really well.
Wow.
And so Bill is laughing because, man, he hated computers. so somewhere Bill is chuckling down on us saying, see, I told you.
Anybody else?
The most complicated.
I love it, man.
I just started writing.
I'm just wondering, do any of you have any exciting new projects that you're currently working on? Anything we should be keeping our eyes out for coming down the line?
That seems like a shill in the audience.
Yeah, that's an easy one.
So, Rose, you're working on a book.
I am,
Yeah, that was the question, is, are we working on anything new? And
yes,
so,
yes.
And there's a management answer.
yeah.
Anything you can talk about. My day job is I'm a senior writer for Elder Scrolls Online, which is why I can talk about the connection between between Endless Quest books and conversations within there. So I've had a couple of the expansions, Necrom and Athalia. Those have been contained things I've written, and I'm continuing to work on new stuff. So that's what I do day to day. Which needs novels, let's say.
And right now, I'm still getting through all the obligations that I promised to write. So I've got lots of little projects. And what I'm doing in between is doing Realms Lore videos on YouTube
Yeah.
and on Patreon and answering things on Greenwood's Grotto on Discord to keep my hand in. And one of the last obligations is to my friend Andrew Volkowskis, who does a Viking role-playing game, Fate of the Norns Ragnarok. And the Vikings really did conquer the future Dublin
Yeah.
in 795, whatever, and they held on. They got pushed out and came back, and so I'm detailing a fantasy version of that. So 98 city blocks, every building done. Mike Schley is now starting on all the floor plans.
Wow.
And there's an NPC in every building. They all have a dirty secret, because you can have social combat blackmail in the game as opposed to putting your sword through somebody. And you get the menus in all the restaurants, you get the price lists in all the shops, and it's killing me.
Now you've done something similar earlier.
Yes.
Because I have a copy of that. Is that,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
an earlier version of this? Or
No, we did the overview.
Okay.
And it's now going to ship as a box for the Kickstarter backers.
Ah.
And I'm now doing the deep dive in thirds of the entire city.
Right.
That gets like everything.
Yeah.
So this isn't a perfect example of something you should never agree to do. But on the other hand, it is something that nobody has ever done before.
Wow.
And after I've done the legwork, you can all like plunder it for your own fantasy cities, just a city block at a time.
Yeah.
Just pick it up and dump it in Waterdeep, or pick it up and,
How about you, Jim?
Before I answer that, I'm going to try and do service to my other colleagues in the book departments over the years. I mentioned some of the other people who work there, but if you've read any of the TSR novels over the entire span of it, Peter Archer and Phil Athens, who started with Brian Thompson after Mary Kirchhoff left, and then went to Wizards. There were a number of people, Susan Morris and Aaron Evans, who also, both of them did writing,
Right.
but worked as editors at Wizards of the Coast as well. Stacy Whitman and Nina Hess, who did like the Mirrorstone line.
And I'm just going to add, Aaron has a successful line of novels.
Yep.
And has just done a RuneScape as well.
Yep.
And Susan Morris will have her first novel, Strange Beasts, come out in October. Don't miss it.
Right. And so when you read all of this fiction, especially after when the department coalesced in the late 80s and continued all the way through where they're to now with the things that they're doing and improving at their best, the R.A. Salvatore books, there are editors and actual professional editors who did work in these lines who the quality that you saw reflects all of their hard work. Yes,
Yeah,
and
you.
I'm working, actually doing a lot of creator-owned stuff. I'm doing some game design on things like Cats of Cthulhu. I got to write a super cool adventure. Matt worked on that as well. And that ties into other fiction that I'm doing, which then ties into things like the Dagon Collection, which is a fake auction catalog of artifacts recovered from the federal raid on the Dagon cult in Shadows over Innsmouth. And a bunch of authors created fake items and then wrote up the catalog entries for them. And
So there's now an FBI file on all of those.
yeah, there already was on me, but you know, the book that I wrote about the geometry of nowhere for that is one that actually appears in my short stories and things like that. A lot of the things that I do go back to that sort of transmedia things that I learned working in the department and working in the comics and working with these special people as creators.
For myself, I've actually just I've got a D&D interactive audiobook that's only available in France.
Wow.
In French, right? This little device called the Looney. The last couple of years have been subsumed by the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game, which is a tabletop Marvel game. Thank you. One guy.
Two guys.
There we go, two, sorry, there we go. And I'm also working on, I've been doing Minecraft novels, and I've got a graphic novel coming out for a video game it's not been announced yet. I can't tell you which one it is, but it's a VR game coming out later this year. And what else? My son Marty has been writing with me too. We just had a World of Warcraft Chronicle 4 book come out in July, so. And lots of other new stuff coming out.
Yeah.
But we should probably.
We should
end it.
probably,
Yeah.
we are at
Well
time.
timed there, that's
Yep.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.